your reaction to this 3/4 of a point historic increase in the interest rate?
Well, it wasn't unexpected. I mean, most people expected it. Most economists and analysts expected this was coming. But let's make absolutely clear there is no question it is going to fall on average people. I mean, in terms of the student loan debt increasing, mortgage rates increasing, credit card rates increasing. They've already increased over the last 6 months, 8 months. They're going to continue to increase. And it's not clear that the fire that the Fed is fighting is actually here in the United States. The fire is coming from all over the world in terms of inflation. Supply chain problems are global. Most countries are suffering from inflation. Ukraine and the problems of Ukraine in terms of food and energy, and Russia, what Russia's doing, are all out of the ambit of the firefighting by the Fed. And so this may be very effective in terms of actually the hose, to use the metaphor, not overusing the metaphor that the Fed is employing. And there may be a lot of firepower there, but it's not really, the danger is it's not really reaching the sources of the inflation, and we may find ourselves in a recession as a result.
I like the firefighter metaphor. I get it. That one makes sense. Dylan, do you think there was a different way to put out this fire, a better way?
Well, I mean, again, when you're fighting a fire, well, just to stay with Mr. Reich's metaphor, and hello, Mr. Secretary, you need everything you can get. And I think two things. One, rates are the obvious thing. The second thing is to distinguish between the war and the sanctions, because the sanctions and the war are not the same thing. And the sanctions, to the degree to which they can be modified in a way that they provide less stress in Europe and the United States and more stress on Russia, which is the target for those sanctions, I think is something that needs to be debated and considered. I think that they may be very well intended, but I think we do ourselves a disservice when we say, well, the Russian invasion of Ukraine created this inflation. For sure, it creates supply disruptions. We know the grain issues, we know the steel issues, we know the fertilizer issues. That's not a true statement, but the only other lever the firefighter has would be a review potentially of whether some of the sanctions can be adjusted in a way that gives you a little bit more leverage. The other thing I just would say for context, we're talking about rates going to 2.5%. Okay, like so before everybody freaks out, you had an economy that was on 0% interest rates for the last decade, and after all of this historic, extraordinary, extreme things, you're now at 2.5%.
Matt, the Fed Chair Jerome Powell will be taking questions in about 25 minutes. What's the most pressing question he has to answer?
Well, I think the question is the one that's on everyone's mind. The question is, how can you get this just right? Because Jerome Powell has to thread the needle here, right? In the press conference, he wants to signal that the Fed means business here. They take this inflation fight very seriously, and they're not going to let up until they get inflation under control. But they also want to give themselves some flexibility, because the next Fed meeting isn't until late September, and we're going to get additional inflation and jobs and consumer spending numbers. So they also want to give themselves some wiggle room where they don't get boxed into having to do another massive interest rate hike if perhaps that's not what's actually needed. I just want to go back to one point that Allison had asked, is what else could the Fed maybe do, or what else could they have done differently? Going back to the firefighter metaphor, arguably, with the benefit of hindsight, they were late to the scene of this fire, right? They didn't actually begin raising interest rates until March, and even then it was just a quarter of a point. And so I think that if they had to do it over again, perhaps they would have moved a bit faster to address this inflation crisis.
Secretary Reich, you've been very consistent all along through this past couple of months, talking about how there's another reason, there's another thing that's driving inflation, and that's basically greedy corporations. And so how does this affect them?
Allison, the Fed is trying to slow the economy down overall. And that presumably would include corporations and corporate profits. But remember, we know last year corporate profits were at a 70-year high. And we also know there's a lot of evidence that corporations were using inflation as a cover for raising a lot of prices. I mean, we have, and this is no secret. I mean, there's a lot of information out there about the margins. That is the gap between what corporations are actually paying for materials and for labor and the actual prices that corporations are charging consumers. And that gap, that markup, was growing right through 2021 and the start of 2022. It may still be growing. It's very important not only to rely on the Fed, but also to consider such things as a windfall profits tax. It is before Congress now. There are more and more members who are interested in doing this. The conservative government in Britain has done this already with regard to oil companies. It ought to be done in those sectors of the economy where we have seen these markups get out of control. There's no reason that consumers ought to be paying this kind of money and at the same time bearing the burden of these Fed rate increases. Mm-hmm.